You're listening to the 4-Phase Cycle podcast with your hosts, Dr. Alex and Megan of ZESTY Ginger. If you're looking to naturally balance hormones and learn how to work with your body instead of against it, you've definitely come to the right place. As a duo of an integrative MD and a functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner and best friends, we use the 4 phases of the female cycle in combination with functional lab work and mindset practices to transform the lives of the women we work with.
We also have a whole lot of fun along the way. If you're new around here, it's best to start with season 1 before jumping around and plan to roll up your sleeves. Showing up for ourselves and enjoying our lives is what good health is all about. Just a quick reminder though, this information is not intended to diagnose, manage, or treat disease. Always consult with your doctor before making changes.
Hi there, it is Alex here for a solo podcast episode, and today is going to be just a little bit different in that even though Megan and I talk a lot about various topics that impact our health, our lives, our happiness, and our contentment with what's going on. However, this topic is even a little bit more, esoteric in nature, in that today I wanted to talk about living from sense. And by sense, I mean intuition, right? It's just, I think there's lots of different terms used for this. And I think depending on who you ask, they're going to say these terms mean something completely different, or at least, ballpark, but different. And for me, the reason I use sense is because intuition, a lot of times for me, is more characterized by I get the sense that, I get the intuition that I need to ask a question or something is happening that I need to look into, right? Intuition's like, this place where I'm parked, is this okay, right? It usually starts as a question. And then sense is that sort of inner knowing that then follows a question like that. So that's how I'm defining it. And so if for you, that is essentially the definition of intuition, cool. It does not matter. That's not the point that I'm making in this podcast episode. What I do want to talk about is, now that we're kind of on the same page in terms of the definition, what does it really look like to live a life where we are following our sense? There's a couple layers here in terms of where we are when we hear topics like this. So for some of us, we really haven't thought about this much, right? We're just like, I do things because I decide to do them and they make sense and whatever. And I did that for a really long time. And in the grand scheme of things, it worked just fine, right? So we're all in different places. And when I would hear stuff like this, it would just kind of skate by my awareness and no problem. And then there's those of us who are in a place where we're really starting to be shown, hey, there's this different way of living and being and different way of making decisions from that place. So we can be anywhere along that spectrum, and really where I hope to be, and I think there's people already in front of us, is there's some people who purely live from their sense, and that's how they operate in the world. So there's that dynamic. The other layer to it is that some of us are more sensitive in terms of we are more designed with the sense leading the charge in mind, or some of us are more, making decisions from other modalities and other things going on. And so one of the systems that Megan and I have been learning about recently, and it's pretty popular, so I imagine that you've come across it, is human design, right? And it's just a different way of categorizing people. Now, with any sort of system like that, whether it's Myers-Briggs for personality or DISC profile for personality and kind of the way we behave in the world, or this human design, the way I think about it is that it's a framework to help us understand certain facets of ourselves and our behaviors and our way of living and making decisions. It is not an end-all be-all to who we are. And you've probably heard things like this. Like, people are like, I'm a Sagittarius, which I am. And that means I do X, Y, Z, right? And so even the things that people don't like about themselves, they'll be like, well, it's because I'm a Sagittarius, right? Like, I just have no filter, which is also true about me. But it's one of those where it's like, how much do I really want to identify with all of these things, good or bad? And the same is true then for human design, where in my take of it, I find it very, very helpful for getting insights, seeing what may jive with me, right? Getting more information, seeing what rings true and what doesn't, and leaving the things that don't. And so while I'm going to talk for a moment about human design, it doesn't matter to me how you feel about it, whether you're diehard into it or you've never even heard of it. My only point is that I'm really only using that as a general discussion tool and not something that pigeonholes people into being a certain way or having a certain identity. So on the human design path, there's different types of designs that people can have, and mine is a projector. And projectors are much more designed to live from sense within the system, the way that the system's created, or at least referenced, is that we're much more kind of internally feeling guided than potentially some other people. So regardless, we can be on the path of living from our sense, but then we can also have another layer, which is what level of that applies to us for who we really are and what's going to work for us in our life. And for me, the reason I wanted to do this podcast episode is that I tend to fall fairly far on both spectrums, right? I'm designed to live from sense, and because it's been something that's been in my awareness for a while, and really I had that a lot in childhood, then it was sort of conditioned away. I told it was weird, that doesn't make sense, right? We're told that kind of stuff, which we'll circle back around to. Then I lost, quote, I'm doing quotes, you can't see, but I lost some of that. And then in my adulthood, the way life itself, I was then challenged to drop the conditioning again, right? Because for a while I was cooking along being like, I'm good at doing the checkbox life, right? It was like, go to high school, check. Go to college, check. Meet a nice guy, check. Graduate college, check. Marry the nice guy, check. Go to medical school, check, right? And I got stuck on the having babies check mark, and that kind of broke my heart enough that it cracked open the possibility of living in a different way, because I really had to stop and be like, is this whole thing making sense? And anyone who's been around, this was years ago, and that really catapulted this entire next chapter of life that I've been in. And so then, other things happened that have propelled me to live from that even more, and it seems like I'm entering an era that it's no longer negotiable. This isn't something that's like, it would be nice if I had this more, or hey, pay attention to this as a curiosity. It really has become, how can I live predominantly from this place? And because I have been repeatedly but, and I'm being completely transparent here, repeatedly bumping into my conditioning around this. And there have been some real challenges and things that I've learned in the process while I'm nowhere near done. I'm sure this is going to be like a series of sorts spread out over time. But essentially, there's things I've learned along the way that I've been able to use. And I think that even though I'm still very much on that path and I'm still learning and growing in this capacity, there are some things that I just felt like I could share and contribute to anyone who is starting down this path but feels like it's rocky. Because honestly, my experience has been that it's very rocky. It's kind of like you learn to crawl, you learn to walk, and you learn to run, and you're on a bike, and you're flying in a plane, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, this plane is going to crash. Then you crash and you're like learning to walk all over again. And it's not, none of that process, whether it's because we get, something happens to our health, or something blows up in our life, or we lose our job, or someone close to us transitions off the planet. It doesn't matter what the plane crash is, but a lot of times we are then left in a place where we're like, I can't keep doing what I was doing. I need to live a different way. And I think this is just one facet of that. And I want to acknowledge that anyone who's in this position, whether it's about living from sense or any other way, really, it's challenging. It feels like you're like learning to crawl, right? And you're dragging yourself around, and then you're walking, but you keep falling down, and it's never that pretty. And certainly when it's when it's like a friend, and Megan's been great for this, right? Because she can watch me, and I keep falling, but she basically treats me like, if I was a kid that was learning to walk, she would never be like, what are you doing? Why can't you walk yet? Right? And that's exactly what she's been like. She's been like, hey, you're learning to walk. That's cool. But when it's you, it feels like all of these thoughts come up. I should be farther along. I should be better at this. I was farther along here, therefore, why am I not here on this topic? Or why am I messing all of this up? And this is so new. I just don't know how to even handle this situation, right? It's like ad nauseum, the amount of things that come up when we're doing something like this. And especially something that you can't see from the surface, right? When we are like, hey, I am no longer willing to tolerate this in my life, and I'm going to work on self-worth so I don't keep manifesting the same experience over and over in my life. You can't see self-worth, right? And just the same way you can't see sense. There's not like a neon light that goes on in my bedroom there I'm like, oh, I did it. It's the same thing where self-worth, and you're like, where is that line? And you can't see it, you can't taste it, you don't know when you're crossing it. And so it's this very iterative process where you just kind of do stuff and then get the feedback of whatever outcome. And it could be like a feeling, or something happens and you're like, that felt good or that felt bad, and then you take that. But when you're in it, it of course feels really, really messy, because the feedback process sometimes feels really shitty, and a lot of times it seems like it does, especially in the beginning. And so, okay, let's break it back down to sense, because those are all the things that kind of play into it. But when it comes to living from sense, what I think that a lot of us are going for when we work on something like this, and this is certainly true for me, is that our goal is to live an aligned life that feels good. I mean, and a lot of times we've done the forcing process enough and ended up with whatever we ended up with. And upon review of that, it kind of comes to light that was not, the results that followed were of the same caliber as the forcing, right? You took a negative input, I have to do this, or I have to have this, or I have to get it done, or I'm going to fail if I don't, or I'm going to be a failure if I don't. You line it up, and I'm sort of editorializing because that's how I felt with like getting into medical school and getting married and all of this stuff, right? It's like coming from a place of, let me rip through these check boxes as fast as possible, and then that energy permeates then the outcomes. And there's a lot of really great outcomes, right? That it's not all bad a lot of times, but there's a reason why people get to a certain point, look around and go, what here feels like it's what I want to perpetuate and what don't I? And the living from sense then comes from, what if there's a different way? Instead of using the forcing energy to have that be the input for the outputs that follow, what does it look like then to come from a place of allowing flow, ease, and letting things unfold? I love the analogy of like you're sitting by the river and you're watching it flow, and then once you see a stick on there floating along that you want, you reach into the river and you grab it. The rest of the time you're just chilling, you're watching it, you're just assessing. Don't want that stick, nope. Don't want that rock, nope. Don't want that leaf, right? And then when you see it, then that's ease and flow. And then there's paddling as fast and as hard as you possibly can up the river, trying to pick up and assess and like overthink, essentially. So what I'm getting at, every rock and stick and leaf that you come across, being like, is this it? Is this it? Is this it? Right? And oof, I don't know if you haven't had this experience. Kudos to you. Please tell me. Please message us. Tell me how to do this. But a lot of us are just exhausted from paddling upstream, trying to make things happen, and it's not even, it's either not happening or not happening the way that we want, or we get it and it's not what we wanted, right? And so then living from sense is chilling by the river, waiting for what makes what we're guided towards be the only thing that we expend energy into, right? Because we're still going to have to get in the river or go up to the river, because that's how, no one's going to like sit around at home and sense $1 million coming into your bank account or whatever. But it's a different expenditure of energy when we're chilling, we're calm, we're at peace, we're in well-being, and then we take specific action because we're called to take that action, rather than all of that motion and commotion and movement and effort. And so that's the analogy that I generally use. However, I think that is also helpful to understanding the problem. We have been conditioned, and this is what I mean by like how I lost, in quotations, how I lost it, is that we are conditioned to go after things. And that hard work and action and activity and being logical and writing pros and cons list and thinking through the timeline and making plans and anticipating problems is the way to live. And for those people who that system works for, right, they are designed to participate within that system well, that system can really work for them. And you look around, there's people who are perfectly happy doing that kind of stuff, right? Though it seems like in the grand scheme of things, and I don't know, this is above my pay grade in terms of, but it seems like there's a bit of a shift. Even so, if there's just a portion of population where that works less well for, and potentially the majority that worked well for them, which is why we were conditioned with those ideas, now it seems like, or at least there's the acknowledgement of that the majority isn't quite as much the majority anymore, and that there's a lot of us that are like, I don't love that, right? There's just this sense of whether you're overtly like, I'm done with this, or you're a little bit more like, I don't love how this is going, or anywhere in between those two. But essentially, because we are conditioned to figure out what we want and then effort towards it, living from sense then, at least in my experience, has been a whole lot of like waiting, right? Because there's a lot of times where I get the knowing of something. And then a lot of times, not always, but especially for like bigger things, there's a period between the sense and the knowing and all of that unfolding. For example, this is a trivial one, right? But, well, it's not trivial to me, but it's a small example of Megan and I talked years ago about how we were going to be on James Wedmore's podcast. It was I do, if I'm remembering correctly, it was something that I brought up, and Megan echoed to me back, like she mirrored back to me, I feel that too, right? And we're like, all right, when we talk to James, when we're on his podcast. And then May 26th, actually, this past year, our episode came out where we were interviewed on James Wedmore's podcast, right? Business by Design. And there were years in between the knowing and the actual interview. And when it's a podcast interview, it was like something that I'd think about, and then I'd go on with my life. And the waiting, I'll be honest, I'm not the most patient human. So, and I'm not sure I was designed for patience. I think I'm designed for swiftness. But that I had a little bit easier time waiting for. But when it's something big for us, like we're looking for the love of our life, or we are in a really tough financial decision and we have a business and we want it to be making money, right? Or our kid is sick and we want them to be better. Fill in the blank with whatever is going on. But when it's something big like that, the waiting a lot of times to me feels so difficult. Like it feels like torture, where you're like, but I know this is in store for me. Like this is out there. Why am I not getting it? And I think that's the conditioning crux of living from sense. And this is an area I am still very much getting better at. However, I will say, that river analogy, the reason I brought it up here is because it helps me so much of like, if I have to wait anyways, do I want to tire myself out and make myself crazy in the process, or am I cool chilling by the river? And I literally I had a session with a human design person that Megan had one, and then she was like, you got to do this. So I signed up for that. And I literally asked her, I was like, because we were talking about this whole process, and she's like, that's exactly what you're designed for. Like, and then things will happen and unfold. But unfortunately for you, that is the gift and the curse, right? You do know it up front, but then you have to wait. If I didn't have any idea about it, I wouldn't have to wait, and I would have other things, right? But that's my deal. And I was like, what do you do in the meantime? I just straight up asked her. And she was like, I don't know, you take a shower, you go on a walk, you eat some food, you call a friend, do whatever. And it was as obvious as that sounds. I think that when you're doing something like in a completely different way than you ever have, sometimes you need that, like, what seems obvious, but just as a reminder to say, hey, there's nothing wrong here. Like, you just get a drink with a friend and you just hang out till you get there. And that has been really, really helpful, because I think some of this is so built into how life unfolds that as long as I can roll with the punches of that as easily and effortlessly as possible, then that's exactly what my experience will be in the meantime. That being said, I noticed less of a lag over time as I go in and go all in into the sense that I get. I think a lot of us, part of the waiting is that hard, is that we then second guess ourselves. And I'm also still on this journey, because I'm certainly not there yet, but I'm a little further along, so I think I can, verbalize here the process so far. And of course, I'll update you as I go. But because we have to wait, and it doesn't make logical sense, right? It's your internal sense, but it doesn't, you're like, well, if this is going to happen in life, then I'm going to need to find a job. I'm going to need to change my health insurance. I'm going to need to find a new apartment. I'm going to have to worry about my school loans being paid in a different way. What am I going to do for insurance in the meantime? Right? There's all of these questions about what's happening. And because sometimes those answers don't seem to fit neatly into the overall sense that we're getting, right? Let's say you're like, I'm going to move to Arkansas, and you're going to move this year. And you're like, but I don't have anything set up. Like, maybe I should, what's the deal there? And because things don't make sense, you're like, I don't have a job there, I have a job here. Then we get into our own heads, and that is the conditioning, where we're essentially discounting our own sense and overwriting it with things that seem logical. And I'm sure that you've done this at some point or another in your life with things big and small, but it becomes more prominent the more that we choose to live this way and make decisions, because there's less and less being logical, and there's more and more waiting for that impulse to guide us, irrespective of what is happening on the surface. But the more that we go back and forth, and we're basically like, I want to move to Arkansas. I'd love to move to Arkansas, but I don't think that's going to happen. But I really, really want it to happen, but I don't see anything happening. Like, I don't have a job yet, right? And so it's this constant back and forth. And so it's like, if we go back to the river analogy, how effective are we at assessing and looking at what we want to pick up from there or not, if we're just frantically running in and out of the river every 5 seconds, just like chicken with our heads cut off? And that's, again, this is a silly example, but I think visually it kind of helps, at least me, to think about what I do to myself internally, right? I want that, but I can't have it. I want that, but I can't have it. I want that, but it's not showing up, so maybe I can't have it, right? It's always some sort of iteration of that back and forth. And that seems to really widen the sensing of something and the showing up of something. My theory on that is, you could look at it from a law of attraction standpoint, and I think that that is also true. I do think that from like a more 3D perspective, and I'm more speaking to people who may not have an interest in law of attraction, that's really cool. But when we are constantly going back and forth and second guessing ourselves on something, most of the time are the actions that we're willing to make or to act on, in the 3D kind of real world, also reflect that back and forth, right? Because if you're like, well, yeah, I'll get something set up, and then like, oh, this isn't ever going to happen. I'm never going to have it, so I'm not going to do that. Then we stop and we essentially slow ourselves down. So I've caught myself doing this on a lot of occasions, where it's like what I want and what I sense that I can have. When I doubt, I don't follow it up with the actions that it would be necessary for me to facilitate that happening. And sometimes there's a little bit of a back and forth in terms of the waiting period, right? Because sometimes it really is more waiting and less action. For the most part, I've noticed in those cases, it's a lot of internal work, right? Because waiting is almost never as passive as it seems on the surface. A lot of times there's like up leveling, challenging of beliefs, being like, I'm so sick of believing that. Like, I had to sit with myself on the I can have things that I want. I'm like, I'm so sick of always questioning if I get to have the things that I want in this life. I'm just not willing to put myself through that anymore. And like, if I can choose any sort of interpretation and belief to tell myself that makes me feel good, why don't I pick one that actually makes me feel good, right? So a lot of the waiting sometimes is that, and then almost, to a certain extent, in almost every scenario there's some action, and then there's some scenarios where there's still quite a bit of action, but there we're still in that period, right? And so if even on the action, we can go back and forth on the beliefs and the thoughts all the time, but even when that gets looped into the actions that we do, like, I want to have a successful business, I'm going to post and do lives, and then, oh, it's not going fast enough, I'm going to quit doing those. So, I don't care, I'm never going to have that successful business. That's where it really starts to derail us. And I think that's what a lot of people mean about self-sabotage. And I think that is true on that self-sabotage topic, but I think that plays out in more areas than just where we mess up. It's just what actually happens and shows, like, what are we willing to be responsible for? Because it's so much more courageous. This is my interpretation, right? But what I perceive that I've learned over this time is that living this way requires so much more courage, because it's comforting to go out and do stuff and try to predict and like set things in stone and know exactly what the answer is, and like that stuff feels better because it soothes our like waiting, and we feel in control. But this requires a lot more courage to say, I want that. My having of it is inevitable. And my biggest work is to hold that vision so strongly and clearly and powerfully that I have no choice than to cause it to materialize. Right. And there's varying degrees of where life meets us in this process, but also there is almost always action that we take, right? So it's like if we're looking for our soulmate, we're not going to stumble across them for the most part sitting at home. I mean, yeah, sure, weirder things have happened than that, but just illustrating the point of like, then you got to go talk to another human if they're going to be your, if you're going to figure out that they're your soulmate, or interact with them in any way at all, texting on the internet, whatever it is that floats your boat. But that's what it essentially becomes, is that how do we believe in our own sense so much that we have the courage to really then go all in on it and follow it up with some action. So that's kind of where I want to wrap up with this episode, is that one of my ways that I've learned to practice this is following my sense on smaller topics, or even on the really big topics, taking some sort of action consistently, not every day, like it's just whenever I feel like it, but things that really matter to me and I have the sense about them, I will take small actions every couple days or so to make that happen. So let's say you're looking for a partner who already has kids, because you have kids and you think that that's the version of what you want. Potentially, and this is an example, I have no idea what would jive with you, but what if you went to a toy store and intuitively, and used your sense, I shouldn't use intuitively since I made that distinction, sense into what toys stand out to me. Right? You're not saying like, this is the person and that it has to look like this and that, right? That's more of that control, and I totally get that the desire for that is there. However, we can take action in a less direct way, but that still says to us and the universe that like this is how all in that I am. Right? Sorry, like if health is your goal and you have fatigue so bad that you can't run but you want to run, you know, what if the action was going on Zappos and favoriting the running shoes you like? Like, you don't even have to buy them. You don't have to have them. You don't have to do anything with them. Like, what if you just looked at them and just were like, yeah, those are the ones I'm going to get? Because with this stuff, if the second guessing is what really generally throws a wrench in our whole ability to sense, the more we demonstrate to ourselves that I will pay attention, I will listen. And worst case scenario, you don't buy those shoes. Worst case scenario, someone else gets those toys, you donate them. Right? It doesn't, even if it doesn't happen exactly the way that you thought it was going to unfold, what it does in the meantime is reinforce to you that what you believe matters, and more importantly, you are actually willing to believe it so much that you'll take action on it. And these actions can be really tiny, or they can be really big. It's kind of up to you. I mean, another idea, I'm just kind of spitballing ideas to get the juices flowing, but write a letter. You know, if this is about your health, writing a letter to yourself from that new vantage point, or from your vantage point now, thanking your future self for her courage in getting there. Or if it's a partner, writing a letter to that future partner saying like, man, this is where I was at and I'm so grateful for you. Like, this is the vision that I hold, and I'm like, when I write letters to myself, I oftentimes will start them with like, I'm so proud of myself for even being at the place to write this letter. Just acknowledging that like I'm showing up in that way, I'm starting the process, and this is something that is to be celebrated and appreciated. I want me to know that, you know, me showing up for me is me living from sense, and me trusting in my knowledge and self-worth and discernment ability to make these kind of things happen. And so really, I think these small things, even when we get into self-doubt or second guessing, to me, that stuff seems kind of par for the course, to be honest. But when we counteract it, or at least when I have counteracted it like that, it does help. It really, over time, has seemed to teach me that that is an important facet of myself, and I can trust in that. And then I even do little things, like if I am going to the store and I need cream or whatever, and I'm like, I'm gonna just, I spend 10 minutes walking around the store, and I will look for what I feel or what I sense is yummy and what I need. So, you know, that is super low stakes. Or going on a walk where you're like, I don't have, you know, as long as you're in a safe place, I don't have an agenda for where I'm going. I'm just gonna like turn right and turn left and go in a circle, you know, walk through those trees, whatever you got, right? And I do stuff like that too. That's not tied to any sort of outcome that I want, right? That's separate. But it's just getting that awareness of, how do I get the information so that when it is on a big thing and I am being pulled, like, yeah, go buy those toys, then I know the difference between a thought, like a conscious thought I'm having, and an actual sense of, I'm being called this way, let's head that way, actually, right? And so these are all different ways to get at it. I hope that this was helpful in some ways for you, no matter where you are. I think a lot of us are at least on a journey to incorporate some aspects of this, right? Especially in health, a lot of people are making the transition from what do other people tell me that I need to do versus what feels good. And so whether it's just that, you're wondering about your health, or you want to apply this to all facets of your life like I'm doing, I just hope it was helpful to hear. Even though I'm still in the process, a lot of times when we're in the thick, we have things that we're, like, these are things I've come up with to help me along this way, and I hope that served you and was helpful in any capacity at all. So thanks for hanging with me today. Thanks so much for this community. We love you guys. Your support is just amazing and means the world to us. So I hope that you're having a wonderful week, and we will catch you next time. Bye.
Thanks for coming out to hang with us on the podcast. It is our goal to transform the way women are treated in healthcare. And we need your help. We need your help to get the word out. We have a lofty goal of 1 million downloads. And we know that as this podcast grows, we're going to be able to reach more women, get more amazing speakers for you, and bring the most cutting-edge information.
If you found these podclasses helpful, please take a moment to text 5 women you know the link to the series. We appreciate your help so much. Can't wait to see you next time.